During the flight, Helen demanded that the elderly man leave immediately. But when she walked into the most important meeting of her life, she encountered an unexpected presence that would change everything. Helen Morris was gazing out of the panoramic window in the airport's VIP lounge, distracted by the flawless reflection of her own face in the glass. Her sharp eyes carefully examined every detail of her appearance: meticulously styled hair, flawless makeup, and luxury designer clothes that exuded wealth and power. She knew that in the business world, image was everything, and she made sure to be impeccable. The international flight she was about to board was just one of many she took each year, always in first class, and of course, it was the least someone like her could expect. Beside her, Lucy, her personal assistant, was organizing documents and checking Helen's itinerary for the third time. Lucy was young, ambitious, and came from a humble background, traits that Helen valued because she knew Lucy was loyal and hard-working, always willing to go the extra mile to meet her demands. However, lately, Lucy had started to internally question some of her boss's attitudes, although she would never dare express it. When the boarding announcement was made, Helen rose with the same elegance she did everything in life. Her heels echoed on the polished marble floor as she walked toward the gate, closely followed by Lucy. They were the first to board, as was customary, and were soon seated in the luxurious leather seats of first class. Helen appreciated the comfort, the exclusivity, and especially the clear separation between herself and the rest of the passengers. Minutes later, the other first-class passengers began to arrive. Helen was lost in her thoughts, mentally planning the next steps to expand her chain of luxury stores, when a scent suddenly intruded on her space. A strong, distinct smell, something she immediately associated with animals. She frowned and looked around, trying to identify the source of her discomfort. That's when she saw him. An elderly man, dressed simply with a crumpled straw hat, was settling into the seat diagonal to hers. He carried a small, worn-out canvas bag, and his serene expression stood in stark contrast to Helen's visible discomfort. He exuded a strong smell, a mixture of earth, hay, and animals, something that Helen, a woman used to expensive perfumes and sterilized environments, found completely intolerable. Helen immediately called over the flight attendant, her voice low but full of authority. "There's something wrong here," she said, discreetly pointing to the old man. "I don't think he should be here." The flight attendant, a young woman with a professional appearance, looked at the man with a hint of doubt but approached him politely. "Sir, can I help you with something?" The old man smiled kindly, his eyes showing a genuine warmth that seemed to be lost in the modern world. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, his voice calm and soft. "Just waiting for the flight." Helen couldn't believe the attendant hadn't understood the situation. "I'd like to know if this man should be here," she insisted, now with a hint of impatience in her voice. "There's a very strong smell coming from him. It's bothering me, and I'm sure it will bother the other passengers too." The attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Ma'am, all first-class passengers are entitled to this space," she explained, trying to remain calm. "But if there's anything we can do to make your trip more comfortable, please let me know." Helen felt her blood boil. How could they allow someone like that man to sit there, disrupting the peace and luxury she so prized? "I demand that he be moved elsewhere," she declared firmly. "This is unacceptable." The attendant, sensing the gravity of the demand, excused herself and walked away to consult with the flight supervisor. During this brief interval, Helen exchanged glances with Lucy, who, although also uncomfortable with the smell, was clearly uneasy with Helen's attitude. This was going too far. The supervisor soon arrived, a middle-aged man with a serious and professional expression. He listened to Helen's complaint with patience, but responded clearly and directly. "Miss Morris, I understand your concern, but we cannot remove a passenger just because of an odor. Everyone has the right to be here. I can offer you a seat further away if that helps." Helen was stunned by the refusal. Never before had anyone dared to challenge her demands like this. She felt a mix of anger and disbelief as she glanced at the old man, who remained serene, oblivious to the confusion he was causing. She was about to insist when the plane began taxiing on the runway. She looked outside, trying to calm down, but the discomfort persisted. The smell, the presence of that man, everything felt wrong. Helen's irritation grew by the minute until, finally, the plane took off, and she had no choice but to endure the unbearable situation, at least for now. The tension in the airplane cabin lingered as the minutes dragged on. Helen, unable to focus on anything else, cast furtive glances at John, trying to figure out how someone so simple could be in first class. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none seemed conceivable. It was impossible that someone like him, with his worn clothes and smell of farm animals, could afford such an expensive ticket. Lucy, sensing her boss's growing discomfort, tried to ease the situation. "Maybe he's a wealthy man who prefers a simple life," she suggested in a low tone as she adjusted the papers in her folder. It was an attempt to bring some reason to the situation, but Helen merely rolled her eyes, impatient. "Whatever he is, he doesn't belong here," Helen replied, her voice cold. "And frankly, I don't understand why the airline allows this." As the conversation between them continued, John remained in his seat, oblivious to the glances and whispers around him. His expression was one of serenity, as if he was accustomed to uncomfortable situations and knew how to handle them peacefully. To him, the flight was just another step in his journey, a chance to reflect on his life and the choices he had made over the years. John's calm demeanor seemed to irritate Helen even more, and she began thinking of ways to resolve the situation once and for all. Perhaps, once they landed, she could speak directly with the airline management and ensure that this kind of inconvenience would never happen again. In her mind, she was already planning the conversation, where her influence and power would prevail as they always did. But something unexpected happened while the plane was thousands of feet in the air. One of the flight attendants, who seemed to have recognized John, discreetly approached the old man. After exchanging a few quiet words, the attendant stepped away with a respectful smile, leaving John alone once again. Helen observed the interaction with suspicion. That wasn't common. Who was this man to deserve such deference? Her curiosity was now more piqued than ever, and she could hardly wait for the plane to land so she could investigate more about the identity of her troublesome seatmate. The flight continued without further incidents, although Helen's irritation had not diminished. Every time the smell reached her nose, she was reminded of the discomfort that had been forced upon her. When the plane finally landed, and the passengers began preparing to disembark, Helen wasted no time. She was determined to resolve this issue once and for all. As everyone organized to leave, Helen was one of the first to rise. She headed toward the exit, but not without casting one last look at John, who was still moving slowly, unhurried to leave the plane. Determined to learn more about him, she approached one of the attendants standing near the aircraft door. "Who is that man?" she asked, her voice filled with authority. "I noticed one of you spoke with him. What did he say?" The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, perhaps surprised by Helen's direct approach. "Oh, Mr. John," she finally replied. "He's a very well-known farmer." Helen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A farmer? And what is he doing here, in first class?" The attendant smiled, somewhat intrigued by Helen's ignorance. "Well, he's not just a farmer. Mr. John is the founder and owner of one of the largest and most respected animal welfare organizations in the country. He's made million-dollar donations over the years, helping save thousands of animals. Moreover, he's beloved in the community for his humility and generosity." The attendant's words hit Helen like a ton of bricks. She was momentarily speechless, the revelation leaving her stunned. John Tarque, that simple man with the smell of earth and animals, was a millionaire philanthropist. The idea seemed impossible, but there it was, clearly stated by someone who seemed to know the old man well. Lucy, who had overheard the conversation, was also surprised. She looked at Helen, waiting for a reaction, but all she saw was her boss's shocked expression. Helen, for her part, was trying to process the information. How could she have underestimated someone like that? How could she have been so arrogant and condescending toward a man who, in fact, did more for the world than many of the wealthy and powerful people she knew? The weight of the situation began to settle on Helen as she left the plane. With each step she took toward the terminal, she felt more troubled, not just by the smell that had irritated her so much, but by her own attitude. And now, an important meeting awaited her, a business deal that could determine the future of her company. Little did she know, this meeting would force her to confront, in a very direct way, the values she had always considered unquestionable. Helen crossed the airport with firm steps, but her mind was in turmoil. The revelation about John echoed in her head, challenging everything she believed about wealth, status, and power. How could someone who exuded such simplicity be one of the most influential men in the philanthropic sector? It was as if her world had turned upside down. Lucy followed close behind, watching her boss with a look of concern. Helen was known for her unshakable confidence, but at that moment, she seemed vulnerable, something Lucy had never witnessed before. She decided not to say anything, hoping Helen would process everything on her own. The driver was already waiting at the terminal exit, ready to take them to the company headquarters, where a crucial meeting awaited them. Helen settled into the back seat of the luxury car, her thoughts still revolving around John. She tried to pull herself together, mentally preparing for the meeting, but the image of the serene old man wouldn't leave her mind. Upon arriving at the company, Helen was greeted by her team with the usual deference. They were anxious, aware of the importance of the deal to be discussed that morning. Helen was a ruthless negotiator, and everyone expected her to be at her best. But to Lucy's and the others' surprise, Helen seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. The meeting room was impeccably organized, with documents spread across the glass table and a presentation projected on the wall. The environment was modern, elegant, reflecting Helen's personality and the success she had cultivated over the years. Every detail had been carefully planned, but at that moment, Helen felt strangely out of sync with the world that had always been so familiar to her. The executives from the other company were already present, ready to discuss the terms of the contract. Helen, however, was still trying to concentrate. She knew she needed to be fully focused, but the revelation about John continued to trouble her. Then, to her absolute shock, John's name appeared on the list of donors and investors mentioned in the presentation. "Mr. John Oliver is one of the country's biggest philanthropists," one of the executives began, referring to the old man. "He has supported our company for years, especially in projects related to animal welfare. His approval is crucial for this deal to move forward, and he has already shown interest in expanding his contribution." Helen froze in her chair. It wasn't possible. The same John she had scorned on the plane, the man she wanted removed from first class, now held the power to decide the future of her company. It was such a cruel irony that it almost made her laugh, but the laughter turned into a tight knot in her throat. She felt a wave of panic rising, but quickly forced herself to maintain her composure. She needed to find a way to navigate the situation. "I'm sure Mr. John will see the value in what we're proposing," Helen managed to say, her voice slightly trembling but still controlled. "We're ready to discuss any adjustments he deems necessary." The executive smiled, pleased with Helen's apparent confidence. "No doubt, Ms. Morris, we know your commitment to excellence is unquestionable, and with Mr. John's support, we're confident this project will be a success." The meeting continued, but Helen could barely focus on the details. She stayed attentive enough to answer questions and make the necessary points, but her mind was miles away. John's presence now hung over her like a shadow, threatening everything she had built. When the meeting ended, Lucy approached, offering the papers that needed signing. Helen took the pen, but her hand hesitated. Signing those documents meant entering into a deal where John played a crucial role. And what if he remembered who she was? What if he recalled how she had treated him on the plane? The idea of having to humble herself, to apologize, or worse yet, to depend on John's approval, was almost unbearable for her. Finally, Helen signed the papers, but the weight of what she had just done was almost suffocating. As she left the meeting room, Lucy noticed the tension on Helen's face, and for the first time, felt pity for her. She knew Helen was a strong woman, but this situation seemed to be unraveling the walls she had built around herself. Back in her office, Helen sat in her leather chair and closed her eyes, trying to calm her mind. But the image of John, serene and unperturbed, wouldn't leave her head. How could she have been so blind? How could she have so grossly underestimated a man like him? But Helen knew life wouldn't give her time to lament. She needed to find a way to handle the situation, to ensure the deal moved forward without John knowing what had happened. Yet the doubt continued to torment her. What if he already knew? What if he was just waiting for the right moment to confront her? Helen's anxiety grew, and she knew something had to be done. She was about to face the biggest challenge of her career, and perhaps her life. But this time, the enemy wasn't another business competitor. It was her own pride. The days that followed were a true test for Helen. Every time she opened her email or answered a phone call, she expected to see John's name appear. But to her surprise, and in some ways relief, he remained silent. However, the silence didn't bring peace. It only heightened her anxiety, as though he were preparing something, waiting for the right moment to act. Lucy noticed the growing tension in Helen, but she didn't know how to help. The boss, usually so composed, seemed lost in her thoughts. The young assistant knew that something had changed since that flight, and as much as she wanted to understand, she feared getting involved in something that wasn't her business. On the morning of the big meeting with John, Helen woke up early after a restless night. Her thoughts were divided between the fear of being confronted and the need to ensure the success of the deal. When she arrived at the office, she wore her usual armor, an impeccable suit and an expression that betrayed no emotion. But inside, she felt more vulnerable than ever. As she entered the meeting room, she found her team already in place, with expressions of anticipation. There was a certain tension in the air, but everyone was confident that Helen would do whatever it took to secure the deal. She, on the other hand, made an effort to meet those expectations, though her heart was racing. When John entered the room, the atmosphere seemed to shift. His presence, so simple and unassuming, stood in stark contrast to the luxury and sophistication around him. He wore a linen shirt, cotton trousers, and shoes that looked like they had been worn for years but were perfectly clean. His calm, observant eyes passed over everyone in the room before finally landing on Helen. For a moment, the two locked eyes in silence, the weight of what was to come hanging between them. Helen felt a chill run down her spine but kept her composure. John, for his part, offered a slight smile before taking a seat at the table, as if they were about to have a conversation between old acquaintances rather than a multi-million-dollar negotiation. "Mr. John, it's a pleasure to have you here," Helen began, forcing a polite smile. She knew every word would be carefully scrutinized, and she couldn't afford to show weakness. "The pleasure is mine, Ms. Morris," John replied with the same serenity she remembered from the flight. "I hope we can reach a mutual understanding today." Helen nodded, trying to control her anxiety. "No doubt. Your collaboration is extremely important to the success of this project, and we're open to hearing any suggestions or concerns you might have." The meeting proceeded in a cordial, almost formal tone, with executives from both sides discussing the technical and financial details of the deal. Helen participated actively, but her mind was divided. She knew that, at some point, she would have to confront the real reason she was so uncomfortable. Finally, after nearly an hour of discussions, John interrupted the conversation. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his eyes that caught everyone's attention. "Before we continue, I'd like to speak directly with Miss Morris," he said, his voice firm but not hostile. "In private, if possible." Helen felt her stomach twist. She knew this moment would come. But still, she wasn't ready. The team looked at her, waiting for a response, and with a nod she indicated her agreement. "Of course," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Let's go to my office." The two stood up, and under the curious gazes of everyone else, they left the meeting room. The walk to Helen's office seemed longer than ever. When they finally arrived, she closed the door behind them, trying to ignore the tightening feeling in her chest. "Mr. Fajon," she began, trying to control her nervousness. I understand that perhaps there's something that needs to be said. If I've made a mistake, I'm willing to listen." John sat in one of the armchairs, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He observed her for a moment before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Ms. Morris, I'm a man who believes in actions, not words. On the plane, you made an assumption about me based only on my appearance and the smell that accompanies the life I lead. I won't pretend I didn't notice what happened, but I'm not here to reprimand you." Helen felt her face flush with shame. Every word from John was like a blow to her conscience. She, who always prided herself on her intelligence and insight, had failed in a basic test of humanity. I'm sorry for that," she finally said, her voice trembling. "So I acted impulsively and with prejudice." John nodded slowly, as if processing her apology. "You know, Mrs. Morris, I've seen a lot in my life. I've seen people with more wealth than they could spend in 100 lifetimes, but with poor hearts. I've seen humble workers who, despite having little, are rich in kindness and generosity. Money and power don't define who we are. Our actions shape us." John's words resonated deeply with Helen. She knew he was right. Throughout her life, she had pursued material success, believing it would protect her and bring her happiness. But in that moment, sitting across from a man who possessed a wealth far greater than monetary, she realized how wrong she had been. "I've always believed that control and power were everything," Helen admitted, almost as a confession. "But now, I see that, in truth, I'm losing something far more valuable. I was arrogant and blind." John remained silent for a few moments, letting Helen's words hang in the air. Then he leaned forward slightly, his expression showing a lightness she didn't expect. "Miss Morris, I'm not here to judge you. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them. If you truly want to change, that's the first step. The rest will come with time." Helen felt a wave of emotions threatening to spill over, but she held herself back. For the first time in a long time, she was willing to listen, to learn. "I want to change," she confessed sincerely. "I want to do better, to be better. And if you're willing, I'd like to count on your support." John smiled, a genuine smile full of understanding. "I'm willing, Mrs. Morris. Let's do this together." After the conversation with John, Helen felt as if an immense weight had been lifted off her shoulders. His sincerity, without resentment or hostility, had surprised her. John's generosity of spirit, so rare in the world Helen lived in, sparked a new perspective within her. But at the same time, she knew her journey of self-discovery had only just begun. John's words echoed in her mind. What matters is what we do after our mistakes. When they returned to the meeting room, the atmosphere was noticeably more relaxed. Helen sensed the curious looks from her team, but everyone maintained their professional demeanor. John returned to his seat, and the meeting continued, but the tone had shifted. Negotiations now flowed with a naturalness that had previously seemed impossible. It was as if, by confronting her own prejudices, Helen had unlocked a new form of communication, one based on empathy and mutual respect. The terms of the deal were adjusted according to John's suggestions. He demonstrated not only his experience as a philanthropist, but also his skill as a negotiator. By the end of the meeting, with the contract signed and the plans laid out, everyone seemed satisfied. Helen, however, knew that the true impact of that day extended far beyond business. As John bid farewell to the executives and prepared to leave, Helen called him over, still feeling the need to express something that simple words couldn't capture. "Mr. John, before you go, I'd like to extend an invitation. I'd like you to visit my company to understand better how we might collaborate on initiatives that benefit the community." John observed her for a moment, his eyes shining with wisdom beyond his years. "It would be a pleasure, Miss Morris. I believe we can learn a lot from each other." They shook hands, a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. For Helen, it was more than just a formality. It marked the beginning of a new phase, both in her personal and professional life. In the days that followed, Helen threw herself into her work with a new perspective. For the first time in years, she began to rethink the values that had always guided her decisions. Profit and financial success were still important, but now Helen saw the value in something she had previously ignored, the impact of her actions on people's lives and on society. Lucy, meanwhile, noticed the change in her boss. Helen, who had once been rigid and unreceptive to suggestions, now seemed more open, more willing to listen. The assistant was also undergoing her own process of reflection, influenced by the recent events. The admiration she felt for Helen began to transform into something deeper, as she witnessed her boss confront her flaws and work to overcome them. Not long after, Helen visited John's farm. When she arrived, she was greeted by a landscape that looked like something out of a painting. Rolling green fields as far as the eye could see, animals grazing freely, and a simplicity that stood in stark contrast to the luxurious world Helen was used to. John awaited her on the porch of the main house, smiling as always. "Welcome, Miss Morris," he said, as he guided her inside. "I want you to see how we live here and how we care for the animals. I hope it inspires you, just as it has inspired me throughout the years." Helen spent the day exploring the farm, learning about the sustainable practices John had adopted and the importance of respecting nature and living beings. Each story John shared seemed to open a new chapter in her mind, making her realize how much she still had to learn about life and about herself. At the end of the day, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, John invited her to sit on the porch from where they could overlook the valley. "This place is a reflection of who we are, Ms. Morris. Everything here was built with effort, dedication, and above all, respect. I hope that when you return to the city, you'll take a little bit of this with you." Helen looked out at the horizon, absorbing the serenity of the moment. "I'll take more than a little, Mr. John. I'll take a new way of seeing the world and living my life. Thank you for showing me that true value isn't in what we possess, but in what we do with what we have." John smiled, satisfied. He knew the change wouldn't be easy for Helen, but he saw in her a genuine desire to improve, to evolve, and that was enough for him. "I'm happy to hear that, and if you ever need help, I'll always be here." As night fell, Helen said her goodbyes, feeling renewed. The journey that had begun on that flight was far from over, but now she knew she was on the right path. She would return to the city with a new purpose, determined to transform her company and her life, according to the values she had learned from John. Helen's transformation didn't go unnoticed by her colleagues and employees. The former demanding and distant CEO began to become more approachable, more interested in hearing the ideas and concerns of those around her. New initiatives were introduced within the company, focused on social responsibility and sustainability, directly inspired by what she had seen on John's farm. Lucy, especially, was touched by Helen's transformation. The assistant, who had always admired her boss for her strength and determination, now saw a new quality in her: humanity. The relationship between the two deepened, with Lucy becoming more than just an employee. She was now a confidant and collaborator on projects with the potential to make a difference in the world. And so, Helen began to rewrite her story, a story no longer defined only by material success, but by a legacy of positive impact. And it all started with a simple encounter on a flight, where she learned that sometimes the greatest wealth is that which cannot be measured in money. Months passed since Helen's visit to John's farm, and the changes in her life and her company continued to unfold in unexpected and profound ways. What had begun as a personal transformation expanded to impact everyone around her, reshaping not just the corporate culture of her business, but also her worldview. Helen, who once focused exclusively on the numbers and the growth of her company, now dedicated herself to projects aimed at creating positive social impact. She instituted a corporate responsibility program that encouraged her employees to get involved in social causes, supporting everything from environmental protection to animal welfare initiatives, all inspired by the principles she had learned from John. One of the most notable initiatives was the creation of a foundation in partnership with John. The foundation, named after Helen's mother, someone to whom she owed a great debt of gratitude, focused on environmental preservation and animal welfare, promoting sustainability and respect for nature. John's involvement with the foundation not only gave the project credibility, but also ensured that its actions were guided by solid ethical and moral principles. Helen's new approach generated a wave of respect and admiration, both inside and outside the company. Investors and business partners began to notice that the company was not only a luxury retail giant, but also a force for good, committed to creating a better future. Sales at her stores continued to grow, but the real success was measured by the positive impact the company was making in the world. Lucy, for her part, flourished in her new role as the manager of social projects within the company. Her role extended far beyond simply following Helen's orders. She now helped shape the strategies that determined the company's engagement with society. Her relationship with Helen evolved into a true partnership, with both sharing the same vision for a more just and sustainable future. The media also began to take notice of Helen's changes. Once seen as a cold and distant executive, she was now frequently mentioned in articles and interviews as a transformative leader, someone who had recognized her mistakes and reinvented herself in a way that few could imagine. One day, as Helen reviewed the impact reports from the foundation in her office, she received an unexpected call. It was John, inviting her to a special event at the farm. He didn't provide many details, only mentioning that it would be something important for both of them. Intrigued, Helen accepted the invitation and a few days later returned to the farm. When she arrived, she was greeted with the same warm hospitality as always. John led her to a field where dozens of people from the local community had gathered. There was a celebratory atmosphere, and Helen soon discovered the reason. In the middle of the field, a small school had been built, a school that John had funded and that was now being inaugurated. It was a school for the children of the community, a place where they could learn about the importance of nature, animals, and sustainable living. The school bore John's name, but he insisted that it also be a tribute to Helen, recognizing the transformative role she had played in her own life and the lives of others. "This is the legacy I want to leave," John said as they watched the children running around the new school. "And I'm glad to see that you're part of it." Helen felt a deep emotion as she witnessed the tangible impact her actions were starting to have. For the first time, she truly understood what John meant when he said that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the good one can do in the world. From that moment on, Helen committed herself even more to the cause, determined to ensure that her company and her personal life would continue to be a force for good. She understood that the power she had once used to control and dominate could be redirected to empower and inspire. The partnership between Helen and John continued to grow, bringing new projects and initiatives that benefited entire communities. But more than that, Helen felt she had found a new way of living, one that finally gave her the sense of purpose she never knew she was searching for. And so, Helen's story, which began with a simple encounter on a flight, transformed into a journey of self-discovery and redemption. She, who once believed that power and wealth were everything, now understood that the true legacy lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we leave behind for others. In the end, Helen Morris wasn't just the CEO of one of the largest luxury retail chains in the country. She became a leader with a purpose, someone who used her influence to build a better world. And as she watched the children enter the new school, Helen knew she was on the right path. She smiled at John, grateful that their paths had crossed. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "There's no need to thank me," John replied with his usual calm. "You found your way, and now it's your turn to guide others." With this new perspective, Helen prepared to continue her journey, knowing that although the road ahead was long, she was exactly where she needed to be. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button. Until next time.